The Blue Onion Dome still rises above Hartford, Connecticut, a strange monument to an empire that no longer exists. For over a century, the Colt Armory was the most famous weapons factory in America. At its peak, 15,000 workers passed through its gates. The guns they built armed Union soldiers, Texas Rangers, and outlaws from Missouri to Montana. Colt didn't just manufacture firearms. It manufactured American mythology. The revolver became synonymous with frontier justice, with power, with the nation itself. Today, the factory sits empty. The workers are gone. The brand belongs to a check holding company. How does a legend die this hard? Samuel Colt came into the world on July 19, 1814, in Hartford, Connecticut, the son of a textile manufacturer whose business would collapse before Samuel reached adolescence. The family had money once, then they didn't. His mother died when he was 6. His father remarried, shipped the children off to relatives, and tried to rebuild a fortune that kept slipping through his fingers. By the time Samuel turned 11, he was working in his father's dyeing plant, hauling fabric and breathing chemical fumes. It was miserable, grinding work, the kind that crushes ambition in most kids. But Samuel Colt wasn't most kids. He was obsessed with two things: explosions and mechanisms. At 15, he got his hands on an encyclopedia article about Robert Fulton and the early experiments with underwater mines. Something clicked, and he started experimenting with gunpowder, building homemade explosives in the barn, testing detonation systems that terrified the neighbors. His father, desperate to channel this destructive energy somewhere productive, enrolled him at a boarding school in Amherst, Massachusetts. It lasted less than a year. Samuel announced he would demonstrate his scientific prowess by detonating an underwater charge in the school pond during a 4th of July celebration. The charge worked. The explosion was spectacular. It also soaked half the faculty and destroyed a groundskeeper's shed. He was expelled immediately. Here's the thing about Samuel Colt. Failure didn't slow him down. It accelerated him. His father, out of options, signed him onto a merchant ship bound for Calcutta in 1830. The idea was simple. Get the boy away from explosives. Teach him discipline. Maybe he'd come back ready to work a real job. Instead, the voyage gave Samuel exactly what he needed: time to think, and something to stare at. Picture this: a 16-year-old kid standing on the deck of a brig, watching the ship's wheel turn. The helmsman spins it, and the spokes rotate around a central axis. Or maybe it was the capstan, the rotating drum used to raise the anchor. Colt himself told the story both ways, depending on who was buying drinks. What matters is the principle he saw: a cylinder that rotates, locks into position, and can be indexed to align with a fixed point. In his mind, he wasn't seeing a ship's mechanism. He was seeing a gun. The revolvers that existed in 1830 were garbage. Pepperbox pistols with multiple barrels that were heavy, inaccurate, and prone to chain firing all chambers at once, which was exactly as dangerous as it sounds. What if you could have a single barrel, Colt thought, and rotate the ammunition behind it? One hammer, one barrel, multiple shots. He started carving wooden models right there on the ship, whittling cylinders and frames from scraps of lumber. By the time he landed back in America, he had a rough prototype and an absolute certainty that he was going to change the world. He was 17 years old. He had no money, no connections, no formal training in gunsmithing or engineering. What he had was audacity. For a while, that would be enough. To fund his patent work, Colt did what desperate inventors have always done. He became a con artist. Well, a showman anyway. The line was blurry. He reinvented himself as a doctor. He could. A traveling lecturer who demonstrated the miraculous effects of nitrous oxide, laughing gas, on paying audiences across the eastern seaboard. He'd invite volunteers onto stage, administer the gas, and watch them stumble around making fools of themselves while the crowd roared. It was pure carnival hokum. It also made money. For 3 years, from 1832 to 1835, Samuel Colt toured the country as a fake doctor, pocketing enough cash to fund his real obsession. In 1835, he sailed to England and filed his first patent for a revolving firearm. The British patent came through in October. Then he returned to America and filed with the United States Patent Office in 1836. Patent number 138 was granted on February 25, 1836. Samuel Colt, 21 years old, now owned the exclusive rights to manufacture revolving firearms in America for the next 20 years. He had his golden ticket. Here's the kicker. Golden tickets don't mean anything if nobody wants what you're selling. Colt convinced a group of New York investors to back him, and in 1836 they formed the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company in Paterson, New Jersey. The Paterson factory was supposed to be the beginning of an empire. Instead, it became a masterclass in how not to run a business. The guns were innovative, sure. The Paterson revolver was the first practical repeating handgun, a 5-shot weapon that was lighter and faster than anything else on the market. Texas Rangers loved it. They used Patersons at the Battle of Bandra Pass in 1840. And the gun's rapid-fire capability stunned Comanche warriors, who expected the usual one-shot and reload rhythm of frontier combat. But almost nobody else wanted them. The Paterson had serious design flaws. To reload, you had to partially disassemble the gun, which took time and skill. The frame was fragile. The trigger folded away when not in use, which looked elegant but confused buyers. And Colt himself was a nightmare to work with. He fought with his investors, alienated his managers, and spent money on flashy presentation guns for politicians and celebrities instead of fixing the production problems that kept quality inconsistent. The U.S. military tested the Paterson and passed. They didn't see the point of a repeating pistol when single-shot weapons were cheaper, and their soldiers were trained to reload quickly. Without military contracts, the civilian market alone couldn't sustain the operation. By 1842, the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company was done. The factory closed. The investors scattered. Samuel Colt, 28 years old, had burned through his backers' money, his patent, and his reputation. The revolver that was supposed to make him rich gathered dust in warehouses. He was a failure, a laughingstock, the dreamer who couldn't deliver. Most men would have quit, found a steady job, accepted that some ideas don't work out. Colt did none of those things. He pivoted. If guns wouldn't pay the bills, maybe something else would. He spent the next 5 years chasing other schemes: underwater telegraph cables, waterproof ammunition cartridges, explosive mines for harbor defense. Some of these projects showed real promise. He demonstrated his mine system to the U.S. Navy, sinking a moving target vessel on the Potomac River, while President John Tyler watched from the shore. The Navy was impressed. Congress was not. They refused to fund further development. But Colt kept tinkering, kept refining, kept believing that his revolver design wasn't dead, just dormant. He improved the mechanism in his head, sketching modifications on scraps of paper, waiting for the world to catch up to what he already knew, that the future of firearms was repeating weapons, and he held the key. The world caught up in 1846. War with Mexico was coming, and the U.S. Army suddenly needed guns. Lots of guns. Fast. The man who saved Samuel Colt's career was a Texas Ranger named Samuel Hamilton Walker. He was tall, lean, and had spent years fighting Comanche raiders across the Texas frontier. He knew exactly what worked in a gunfight and what got men killed. And he remembered the Paterson revolvers his unit had carried at the Battle of Walker's Creek in 1844. Those guns had been flawed, sure, but they had also allowed 15 Rangers to defeat 80 Comanche warriors. Let that sink in. 15 against 80, and the Rangers won. Walker understood something the U.S. Army brass had missed. A repeating pistol wasn't a gimmick. It was a force multiplier. In late 1846, with war against Mexico looming, Walker tracked down Samuel Colt. The inventor was living in New York, still chasing telegraph schemes and nursing his wounded pride. Walker didn't care about the past failures. He cared about the future. He wanted a better revolver, bigger, more powerful, something that could drop a man or a horse with a single shot. He sketched out his requirements: 6 shots instead of 5, a trigger guard for protection, a loading lever built into the frame so soldiers could reload without disassembling the weapon. Colt listened. For once in his life, he didn't argue. He took notes. The collaboration produced the Walker Colt, a massive 6-shot revolver that weighed 4.5 pounds and fired a .44 caliber ball with enough force to kill at 100 yards. It was the most powerful handgun in the world. The U.S. Army, suddenly desperate for weapons as troops massed along the Rio Grande, ordered 1,000 of them in January 1847. The contract was worth $25,000 for Colt, and it was resurrection. But here's the problem. Samuel Colt no longer had a factory. The Paterson facility had closed 5 years earlier. The machinery was gone, the workers scattered, the buildings repurposed. He had a government contract and no way to fulfill it, so he did what any desperate man would do. He went to a competitor. Eli Whitney Jr. ran a firearms manufacturing operation in New Haven, Connecticut. His father, Eli Whitney Sr., had pioneered the concept of interchangeable parts in weapons production decades earlier, and the younger Whitney had inherited both the factory and the reputation. Colt approached him with a proposition: use the Whitney facilities to produce the Walker revolvers under Colt's supervision. Whitney agreed. It was a marriage of necessity, not affection. Colt hated being dependent on someone else's shop floor. He hated watching another man's workers build his design, but he had no choice. The first Walker Colts rolled off the line in mid-1847. They shipped to Texas just in time for the final campaigns of the Mexican-American War. Captain Walker himself carried a pair into battle. He was killed at the Battle of Huamantla in October 1847, shot while leading a charge. He never saw how his gun would reshape the American frontier, but his legacy was already secured. The Walker Colt proved that repeating firearms could withstand the brutality of real combat. It proved that Samuel Colt's design worked. More importantly, it proved that the U.S. government would pay for these weapons. That changed everything. Colt used the profits from the Walker contract to establish his own manufacturing operation. In 1847, he rented space in Hartford, Connecticut, and began producing an improved model he called the Colt Dragoon. It was slightly lighter than the Walker, more reliable, and easier to manufacture. Army orders kept coming. By 1849, Colt had expanded into a larger facility on Pearl Street in Hartford. By 1852, he was selling revolvers not just to the military but to civilians heading west during the California Gold Rush. The timing was perfect. America was expanding, and expansion meant conflict. Settlers needed guns. Miners needed guns. Everyone heading into territory where law enforcement was a rumor and violence was common needed guns. Colt gave them what they wanted. But here's the thing about Samuel Colt. He wasn't content to simply manufacture firearms. He understood something that most industrialists of his era missed. Selling wasn't enough. You had to create desire. You had to build a brand. He became a master of what we'd now call marketing. He commissioned elaborately engraved presentation revolvers, works of art with gold inlay and ivory grips, and gave them to presidents, generals, foreign monarchs, and anyone else whose endorsement might open doors. He sent guns to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the Tsar of Russia, the King of Sardinia. He didn't expect these men to actually shoot the weapons. He expected them to display them, to talk about them, to associate the Colt name with power and prestige. He placed advertisements in newspapers and magazines, something firearms manufacturers rarely did at the time. He sponsored shooting competitions and frontier exhibitions. He cultivated relationships with journalists who would write favorable stories about his products. When the Great Exhibition opened in London in 1851, Colt shipped over a display of his revolvers and personally demonstrated their operation to crowds of European aristocrats and industrialists. He came back with orders from British officers who wanted to arm their troops with American-made weapons. The press ate it up. Here was a self-made American inventor who had conquered the old world with Yankee ingenuity. Colt played the role perfectly. He was loud, confident, and utterly convinced of his own genius. He told anyone who would listen that his revolver had civilized the frontier, that it was the great equalizer, that God may have made men, but Samuel Colt made them equal. It was brilliant propaganda. It was also, in many ways, nonsense. The revolver didn't equalize anything. It just made killing faster. But the mythology stuck, and mythology sells. By 1855, Colt's operation had outgrown every facility he'd rented or borrowed. The Pearl Street factory couldn't keep up with demand. Orders were backlogged for months. Competitors were circling, waiting for his patents to expire so they could flood the market with imitations. Colt knew he needed to build something permanent, something that would outlast him, outlast the patents, outlast the competition. He needed a monument. He found the perfect site along the Connecticut River in Hartford's South Meadows. The land was cheap because it flooded regularly, but Colt didn't see that as a problem. He saw it as an engineering challenge. He hired workers to build a massive dike, 2 miles long, that would hold back the river and reclaim the meadows for industrial use. Then he planted hundreds of German osier willows along the banks, fast-growing trees that would stabilize the soil and provide raw material for a furniture factory he planned to open later. Samuel Colt didn't just build factories. He terraformed landscapes. The centerpiece of his vision would be the largest private armory in the world. Construction began in 1855. The main building stretched 500 feet along the riverbank, a massive H-shaped structure of brick and brownstone that dominated the Hartford skyline. At its center rose a dome crowned with a blue onion-shaped cupola, gilded with gold leaf and topped by a bronze statue of a rearing colt. You could see it from miles away. That was the point. Samuel Colt wanted everyone in Connecticut to know exactly where the future was being built. The factory itself was a marvel of industrial engineering. 3 stories of manufacturing space, powered by a central steam engine that drove hundreds of machines through an intricate system of belts and shafts. Natural light flooded in through enormous windows 12 feet tall that lined every floor. Colt had studied the most advanced factories in Europe, particularly the British armories at Enfield and Birmingham, and he borrowed their best ideas while adding innovations of his own. The building was designed for flow. Raw materials entered at one end, passed through successive stages of machining, finishing, and assembly, and emerged as completed revolvers at the other end. It was a production line before Henry Ford made the term famous. But the armory was just the beginning. Colt built an entire community around it. He called it Coltsville, and it was his attempt to create a self-contained industrial utopia. Worker housing went up in neat rows along the streets he laid out himself. 300 units, solidly built, rented to employees at reasonable rates. He constructed a beer hall called Charter Oak Hall, where workers could drink and socialize under company supervision. He built a church, a school, and a library. He planted parks and gardens. He even imported a herd of German deer to graze on the grounds, adding a touch of aristocratic elegance to what was essentially a factory town. Picture this: A complete world within a world. Workers woke in Colt-owned housing, walked to Colt-owned factories, worshipped in a Colt-built church, drank in a Colt-operated beer hall, and sent their children to Colt-funded schools. The company wasn't just an employer, it was an entire ecosystem. The paternalism was obvious and intentional. Colt believed that if he controlled where his workers lived, what they drank, where they worshipped, and how they spent their leisure time, he could control the quality of their work. Happy workers built better guns, or at least, workers who knew their housing depended on their employer's goodwill didn't cause trouble. It was welfare capitalism before the term existed, a bargain that traded security for submission. Inside the factory, Colt pushed the boundaries of precision manufacturing. The key was interchangeable parts, components machined to such exact tolerances that any hammer would fit any frame, any cylinder would drop into any revolver without hand-fitting. This idea had been floating around American manufacturing since Eli Whitney Sr. first proposed it in the 1790s, but nobody had achieved true interchangeability at scale. The technology simply didn't exist. Colt invested heavily in changing that. He hired the best toolmakers in America, men like Elisha Root, a mechanical genius who became the factory's superintendent, and eventually its savior. Root designed custom machinery that could cut, drill, mill, and polish metal to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. He built jigs and fixtures that held components in exactly the same position every time, eliminating the human error that plagued traditional gunsmithing. He created inspection gauges that could detect variations invisible to the naked eye. Here's the kicker: the results were revolutionary. By 1857, the Hartford Armory could produce revolvers with parts so uniform that a soldier could swap components between weapons in the field without tools or fitting. A broken cylinder didn't mean a useless gun anymore. It meant a 30-second repair. For military buyers, that was transformational. Armies could stock spare parts instead of spare weapons. Damaged equipment could be cannibalized to keep other units operational. The logistics of arming large forces suddenly became manageable. Production numbers told the story. In 1856, the first full year of operation, the Hartford Armory produced around 5,000 revolvers. By 1857, that number had tripled. The factory employed nearly 400 workers, each one specialized in a specific task. One man ran the barrel boring machine. Another operated the cylinder drilling equipment. Another hand-fitted the trigger mechanisms. The division of labor meant that skilled craftsmen could be replaced by trained operators, workers who didn't need years of apprenticeship to become productive. Colt could hire cheaper, train faster, and scale bigger than any competitor. And he kept scaling. When orders outpaced capacity, he added more machines. When the machines needed power, he upgraded the steam engines. When the steam engines created too much vibration for precision work, he isolated the heavy machinery on shock-absorbing foundations. Every problem was an engineering challenge to be solved, not a limitation to be accepted. The revolver itself continued to evolve. The Model 1851 Navy, a .36 caliber six-shooter, became the best-selling handgun in the world. Lightweight, accurate, and elegant, it was the weapon of choice for military officers, frontier settlers, and anyone who wanted a reliable sidearm. The Model 1860 Army, a .44 caliber designed for cavalry use, followed in 1860 and would become the standard Union sidearm during the coming war. Each new model incorporated lessons from the field, refinements suggested by users who actually pulled these triggers in life-or-death situations. By 1860, Samuel Colt was one of the wealthiest men in America. He built himself a mansion called Armsmere on a hill overlooking the factory, a sprawling Italianate villa with greenhouses, conservatories, and grounds that rivaled European estates. He filled it with art, artifacts, and trophies from his travels around the world. He He threw lavish parties for Hartford's elite. He lived like a Renaissance prince, which was exactly how he saw himself. But here's the thing about empires, built on one man's vision. They're fragile. Samuel Colt had created something extraordinary. He had revolutionized manufacturing, built a brand that was recognized on every continent, and established a factory that would produce weapons for generations. What he hadn't done was prepare for a future without himself. His health was failing. Years of hard living, relentless work, and a fondness for alcohol had taken their toll. By his mid-40s, he was visibly aging, plagued by gout and respiratory problems. He drove himself as hard as ever, refusing to slow down, refusing to delegate real authority, refusing to admit that the empire needed more than one man at its center. And then the country tore itself apart. When Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter in April 1861, Samuel Colt saw opportunity where others saw catastrophe. The Union Army would need weapons, millions of them, and his factory was the only operation in America capable of producing revolvers at the scale the war demanded. Within weeks of the attack, orders started pouring in. The government wanted everything he could make. Colt was happy to oblige. Production exploded. The factory that had been running smoothly at several hundred revolvers per week ramped up to over 1,000 per day. Let that sink in. 1,000 handguns every single day, rolling off the line and shipping to Union quartermasters. Colt hired aggressively, expanding the workforce from 400 to over 1,000 workers in months. He added night shifts. He installed new machinery. He pushed his equipment and his people to the breaking point. The Model 1860 Army revolver became the standard sidearm of Union cavalry and officers, and Colt held contracts worth millions of dollars. But Samuel Colt wouldn't live to see the war's end. On January 10, 1862, less than a year into the conflict, he died at Armsmere. He was 47 years old. The official cause was gout, but the real killer was a lifetime of excess. He had burned through his body the same way he burned through everything else, with intensity, impatience, and an absolute refusal to slow down. The empire passed to his wife, Elizabeth Hart Colt. She was 35 years old, a wealthy widow with a 4-year-old son, and a factory producing weapons for a nation at war. Most people expected her to sell. She didn't. Elizabeth proved to be a capable steward. She retained Elisha Root as factory superintendent and trusted him to manage daily operations while she handled finances, contracts, and the increasingly complex negotiations with government procurement officers. The Hartford Armory kept running. Production kept climbing. By 1863, Colt's factory was churning out more revolvers than every other American manufacturer combined. The money was staggering. Government contracts paid well and paid promptly. Elizabeth Colt became one of the wealthiest women in America, and she used that wealth to cement her family's legacy. She expanded Armsmere, adding conservatories and galleries. She donated generously to Hartford charities, churches, and cultural institutions. She commissioned a memorial church for her husband, the Church of the Good Shepherd, which still stands today. And Samuel Colt had built an empire. Elizabeth Colt built a monument. But the war machine she presided over ran on human suffering. Walk inside that factory in 1863. The noise hits you first. Hundreds of machines stamping, drilling, grinding metal. The sound never stops. It echoes off the brick walls and the iron columns. A constant industrial roar that workers described as deafening. You couldn't hear someone shouting from 10 feet away. After years on the floor, many workers lost their hearing entirely. Then there's the air. Metal dust hung in clouds, glittering in the light from those enormous windows. Workers breathed it with every lungful. No masks, no ventilation beyond the windows themselves. The fine particles settled in throats and lungs, causing chronic coughs, respiratory diseases, and slow suffocation over decades. They called it metal lung. There was no cure. The machines themselves were killers. Spinning lathes, stamping presses, belt-driven drills. Every piece of equipment represented a way to lose fingers, hands, or arms. Safety guards were minimal. Training was brief. The pressure to maintain production meant workers operated at speeds that prioritized output over caution. Accidents were common. A moment's inattention, a loose sleeve caught in a belt, and suddenly a man was screaming while co-workers scrambled to stop the machine. There was no workers' compensation. If you got hurt, you stopped getting paid. If you couldn't work anymore, you were replaced. Here's the thing about that workforce. It was heavily immigrant, Irish fleeing the famine, Germans escaping political upheaval, later Poles, Italians, Swedes. They came to Hartford because the factory was hiring. And the factory was always hiring because the work was brutal and the turnover was constant. These men and women took the jobs Americans didn't want, the most dangerous positions, the longest hours, the lowest pay. Foremen treated them accordingly. Ethnic slurs were common. Favoritism determined who got the better assignments. Complain and you'd find yourself out of work with no recourse. Women worked in the factory too, though in smaller numbers. They were confined to lighter assembly tasks, polishing, inspection, packing. They earned significantly less than men doing comparable work. The justification was always the same. Women didn't need to support families. Women could live on less. Women should be grateful for any wage at all. Children worked alongside adults. The boys as young as 10 operated machines, swept floors, ran errands between departments. Child labor laws barely existed in the 1860s, and those that did were rarely enforced. A family struggling to survive needed every income it could get. So the children came to work in the noise, and the dust, and the danger, their small hands useful for reaching into tight spaces where adult fingers couldn't fit. The hours were crushing. 10 to 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, 60 to 70 hours of labor every week, month after month, year after year. Workers woke before dawn, walked to the factory in darkness, and walked home in darkness. Their lives revolved entirely around the production schedule. Time off was unpaid. Illness was your own problem. And then, the factory burned. On February 5th, 1864, fire broke out in one of the factory buildings. The blaze spread quickly through the oil-soaked wooden floors, fed by stores of gunpowder and ammunition. Workers fled as flames consumed machinery worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. By the time fire companies brought the blaze under control, an entire wing of the complex lay in ruins. Elizabeth Colt didn't hesitate. She ordered reconstruction to begin immediately, using insurance money and profits from ongoing contracts. Within months, the damaged sections were rebuilt, improved, and back in production. The war couldn't wait. The factory couldn't stop. Workers returned to floors still smelling of ash and began turning out revolvers again. By the time Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, the Colt factory had produced over 200,000 revolvers for the Union Army. It had armed the force that preserved the nation. It had made the Colt family wealthy beyond imagination, and it had done so on the backs of workers who sacrificed their health, their safety, and in some cases their lives for wages that barely covered rent and food. This was the bargain of American industrialization. Progress came at a price, and the price was paid by those who could least afford to refuse. The gleaming revolvers that sat in officers' holsters, symbols of Union power and technological achievement, carried the invisible cost of metal-filled lungs and mangled hands, and children who never got to be children. That's the truth behind the polished presentation guns Samuel Colt gave to presidents. That's the reality underneath the mythology of the weapon that won the West. An empire built on innovation and ambition, yes, but also an empire built on exploitation so systematic it was invisible to everyone who benefited from it. The war ended. The contracts stopped. And the Colt factory faced a question it had never had to answer. What happens when peace breaks out? The crash came fast and brutal. In 1865, the Colt factory had produced revolvers at wartime pace, machines running day and night, workers pulling double shifts. By 1866, military orders had collapsed by 90%. Let that sink in. 90%. The government didn't need revolvers anymore. It needed almost nothing. Warehouses across the country sat stacked with surplus weapons, enough to arm America for a decade without manufacturing a single new gun. Elizabeth Colt slashed the workforce. Hundreds of workers who had spent the war years inside that factory suddenly found themselves unemployed. The streets of Coltsville, which had hummed with purpose and prosperity, went quiet. Families that had moved to Hartford specifically for factory jobs now had no income and no prospects. Some left. Others stayed and struggled. The company town that Samuel Colt had built as a showcase of industrial paternalism became a study in industrial abandonment. The factory pivoted to civilian sales, but the civilian market was a different beast entirely. War had flooded the country with cheap surplus revolvers. Why buy a new Colt when you could pick up a used Army model for a fraction of the price? The frontier was still expanding, sure. Settlers still needed guns, but not at the volume or the prices Colt needed to sustain its operation. And then the patents expired. Samuel Colt's original revolver patents had run out in 1857, but improvements and extensions had kept competitors at bay through the war years. By the late 1860s, those protections were gone too. Smith & Wesson had already carved out a position with their cartridge revolvers, weapons that use self-contained metallic ammunition instead of the loose powder and ball that Colt's percussion revolvers required. Remington was producing solid, reliable handguns at competitive prices. European manufacturers were shipping cheap imports that undercut American makers on cost. For the first time since Samuel Colt clawed his way back from bankruptcy, the company faced real competition, and it responded slowly. Here's the problem. Innovation had stalled. Colt had spent years perfecting the percussion revolver while the industry moved toward cartridge ammunition. Metallic cartridges were faster to load, more reliable in wet conditions, and easier to manufacture. They were clearly the future. But Colt clung to the past, continuing to produce percussion models long after the market had signaled its preference. Even when they finally introduced cartridge revolvers in the early 1870s, competitors had already established themselves. The single-action Army, introduced in 1873, would eventually become one of the most famous handguns in history, the Peacemaker, the gun that won the West. It was a beautiful weapon, reliable and powerful, adopted by the U.S. cavalry and immortalized in countless Western films. But its success came slowly. The military contract helped, but civilian sales took years to build. Colt had lost momentum, and momentum in business is hard to recover. Elizabeth Colt stepped back from active management in the 1870s, turning operations over to professional managers, while she focused on philanthropy and preserving her husband's legacy. She would live until 1905, outlasting Samuel by more than 4 decades, watching the company he built struggle to find its footing in a world he hadn't prepared it for. The factory survived by finding new products and new markets. In the 1880s and 1890s, Colt acquired rights to manufacture the Gatling gun, the hand-cranked multi-barrel weapon that represented the cutting edge of military firepower. They produced rifles, shotguns, and eventually automatic weapons as technology evolved. The company became less a revolver manufacturer and more a general arms producer, adapting to whatever the military wanted to buy. Then came another war, and with it, another boom. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, The military needed weapons at a scale that dwarfed even Civil War demand. The Colt factory, which had been limping along on modest contracts and civilian sales, suddenly roared back to life. The centerpiece was the M1911 pistol, a .45 caliber semi-automatic designed by John Moses Browning and manufactured under license by Colt. It would become the standard American military sidearm for the next 75 years. The factory expanded again. Employment surged past 10,000 workers. New buildings went up alongside the original Civil War-era structures. Machine tools that would have astonished Samuel Colt produced parts with tolerances he couldn't have imagined. The company was profitable again, deeply profitable, feeding on the same wartime demand that had made its fortune 60 years earlier. But here's the kicker. This pattern would define Colt for the next century. War brought prosperity, and peace brought crisis. Every time the guns stopped firing overseas, the orders stopped coming from Washington. And every time the orders stopped, Colt scrambled to reinvent itself for a civilian market it had never really understood. The interwar years were brutal. The 1920s brought prohibition, which created some demand for small concealable weapons among both criminals and citizens who feared them. But it wasn't enough to sustain a factory built for military production. The Great Depression made everything worse. By the early 1930s, Colt was barely surviving, cutting staff, cutting wages, cutting corners wherever possible. World War II provided another reprieve. The M1911 was still standard issue, and Colt produced hundreds of thousands of them. They manufactured machine guns, aircraft parts, and other military equipment. Employment peaked at over 15,000 workers, the highest in company history. The factory ran 3 shifts around the clock. Money poured in. And then, in August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war ended. And Colt's executives, if they had any sense of history, must have known exactly what was coming next. The post-war collapse was steeper than anyone anticipated. Military contracts evaporated within months. The 15,000 workers became 10,000, then 5,000, then fewer. The factory that had hummed with wartime urgency went quiet again. Buildings that had been packed with machinery and workers stood half empty. This time, though, the company couldn't simply wait for the next war. The world had changed. American manufacturing was changing. And Colt, despite its storied name and its legendary products, was falling behind. The second half of the 20th century was a slow-motion disaster for Colt. The company that had armed the Union, supplied 2 world wars, and put a revolver in the holster of every cowboy in Hollywood couldn't figure out how to survive in peacetime. The problems were structural, cultural, and ultimately fatal. Start with the competition. After World War II, European manufacturers rebuilt their industries with modern equipment and efficient processes. Companies like Beretta in Italy, Heckler and Koch in Germany, and FN in Belgium produced high-quality firearms at prices Colt couldn't match. Their labor costs were lower. Their factories were newer. Their governments subsidized defense industries as a matter of national policy. American manufacturers, burdened with aging plants and expensive union labor, found themselves undercut on international contracts they had once dominated. Then there was the domestic market. The baby boom generation wasn't buying guns the way their fathers had. Suburbanization meant fewer people hunting, fewer people on farms, fewer people who saw firearms as essential tools of daily life. The cultural shift was gradual but unmistakable. Guns were becoming hobby items for enthusiasts, rather than household necessities, and the enthusiast market was fragmenting into niches that Colt struggled to serve. The company tried to diversify. In the 1950s and 1960s, Colt manufactured industrial equipment, plastics, even dishwashers. The logic was the same desperation that had driven Singer into aerospace. Spread the risk, find new revenue streams, hope something sticks. Nothing did. The diversification efforts drained resources and management attention without producing meaningful profits. By the 1970s, Colt had retreated back to firearms, but the core business was weaker than ever. Management decisions made things worse. The company cycled through executives who seemed more interested in financial engineering than manufacturing excellence. They cut costs by deferring maintenance, reducing quality control, and squeezing suppliers. Short-term profits looked better. Long-term competitiveness eroded. The guns coming out of Hartford developed a reputation for inconsistent quality, a death sentence for a brand built on reliability. And then the workers started fighting back. Labor relations at Colt had never been warm, but they turned hostile in the 1980s. The United Auto Workers represented the factory workforce, and contract negotiations became increasingly bitter. Management wanted concessions, wage freezes, benefit cuts, the usual corporate playbook for struggling manufacturers. Workers who had given decades to the company refused to accept that their jobs and livelihoods should pay for executive failures. In 1985, the conflict exploded. Contract talks broke down completely, and 1,100 workers walked off the job in a strike that would last 4 years. 4 years. Let that sink in. An entire presidential term of picket lines, replacement workers, and mutual destruction. The strike devastated both sides. Workers lost income and benefits they would never recover. The company lost skilled employees, institutional knowledge, and whatever remained of its reputation for quality. Here's the thing about the guns produced during the strike years. They were assembled by replacement workers with minimal training. Gunsmiths called them strike Colts and refused to work on them. The quality was so bad, it became industry legend. The strike ended in 1990 with a settlement that satisfied no one. By then, the damage was done. The Hartford factory, which had employed over 5,000 workers in its peak years, was down to a skeleton crew. Entire departments had been eliminated. Machinery sat idle. Buildings that Samuel Colt had constructed a century and a half earlier stood empty and deteriorating. In 1992, Colt filed for bankruptcy. The company that had armed America since the Mexican-American War couldn't pay its bills. The filing was a reorganization, not a liquidation, which meant the company would continue operating under court supervision while it tried to restructure its debts. But the symbolism was devastating. Colt, the name that had been synonymous with American firearms for 150 years, was officially broke. The restructuring didn't fix the underlying problems. It just delayed the reckoning. The company emerged from bankruptcy in 1994, shed some debt, and stumbled forward. But the competitive pressures remained. The management problems remained. The aging factory and equipment remained. Nothing fundamental had changed. The 1990s brought one brief hope: the M16 rifle. Colt had been producing variants of this weapon for the military since the Vietnam War, and it remained a significant contract. But even here, the company fumbled. In 1988, the Army had awarded Colt an extension on the M16 contract. But the company's quality problems and delivery delays gave competitors an opening. FN Herstal, the Belgian manufacturer, won the contract to produce M16S in 1988, taking over a business that Colt had held for decades. Losing the M16 contract was more than a financial blow. It was an identity crisis. Colt had defined itself as America's gun maker, the company that armed the nation's military. Now that claim was hollow. Foreign companies were producing America's infantry weapons. The factory that had supplied Union cavalry and World War I doughboys and World War II GIs was being pushed out of its own market. The civilian side offered no refuge. Smith & Wesson, Ruger, Glock. These companies had captured the handgun market with products that were cheaper, more modern, and more reliable than what Colt was offering. the single-action army. He used the legendary Peacemaker, still sold to collectors and Western enthusiasts. But that was a niche market, not a foundation for a manufacturing business. By the early 2000s, Colt was a company in name only. Ownership had passed through a series of private equity firms and holding companies, each one trying to extract value from the brand before passing it along. Production continued at reduced levels, but the Hartford factory was more museum than manufacturing plant. The Blue Dome still rose above the city, but it presided over empty floors and silent machinery. In 2015, Colt filed for bankruptcy again. This time, the debts included $250 million in bonds and a pension obligation the company couldn't meet. The reorganization took over a year. When Colt emerged in 2016, it was smaller, leaner, and owned by its bondholders. The new owners promised a turnaround. They always promise a turnaround. The final sale came in 2021. Colt was acquired by CZ Group, the Czech firearms manufacturer that owned Česká zbrojovka, an American icon founded in Connecticut in the 1830s, now belonged to a company based in the Czech Republic. The acquisition made industrial sense. CZ had modern facilities, efficient production, and access to European markets. What they bought was a brand, a name, a legacy they could stamp on products manufactured anywhere in the world. The Hartford factory closed for good. The buildings that remained were sold off, repurposed, or left to decay. Workers who had spent their careers inside those walls were gone, retired, dead, or scattered to other jobs in other cities. The community that had grown up around Colt, when that had depended on Colt for generations, was left to figure out what comes next when the factory leaves. Walk through Hartford's Sheldon Charter Oak neighborhood today, and you'll find what remains of Samuel Colt's empire. The Blue Onion Dome still rises above the skyline, that strange, beautiful landmark visible from Interstate 91 as you drive past. Some of the original factory buildings still stand, converted now into apartments and office space. The complex is called Coltsville, the same name Samuel Colt gave it 170 years ago, though almost nothing inside resembles what he built. In 2014, Congress designated the area a National Historical Park, recognizing its significance to American industrial history. Rangers give tours. Plaques explain the manufacturing processes that once hummed inside these walls. The Church of the Good Shepherd, Elizabeth Colt's memorial to her husband. He holds services for a congregation that has no connection to the factory. It's preservation, which is a kind of death dressed up as respect. The community around the factory never recovered from its closure. Hartford's South End, once a thriving working-class neighborhood built on Colt wages, is now one of the poorest areas in Connecticut. Unemployment runs high. Property values collapsed decades ago and never came back. The shops and bars and restaurants that served factory workers closed when the workers left. What replaced them was vacancy, abandonment, and the slow decay that follows when an economy loses its anchor. The environmental legacy is worse than most people realize. A century of manufacturing left the soil saturated with heavy metals, lead, copper, zinc, the residue of foundry work and metal finishing. The Connecticut River, which Samuel Colt had dammed and reshaped to build his factory, carried industrial runoff for generations. Cleanup efforts have cost millions and continue today. Picture this. The land that Colt terraformed to create his industrial empire is still being detoxified. The willows he planted to stabilize the riverbank are long gone. The dikes he built have been reinforced and rebuilt. The water that flows past the factory site carries traces of poison that will take decades more to fully remediate. And the workers, the thousands of men and women who spent their lives inside that factory, what happened to them? The ones who survived the strikes and the layoffs and the bankruptcies scattered. Some found jobs at other manufacturers. Some retrained for different industries. Many never recovered, their skills obsolete. Their pensions reduced or eliminated in bankruptcy proceedings, their health damaged by decades of metal dust and machine noise. They built an empire and received nothing when it fell. The Colt brand still exists technically. You can buy a Colt revolver today, a single-action Army, or a Python, or one of the AR-15 variants the company produces. The guns are manufactured overseas, or at facilities that have no connection to Hartford. The name is printed on the slide or stamped into the frame, a marketing asset disconnected from any actual heritage. Czech executives make decisions about product lines and pricing. American nostalgia pays the bills. Here's the kicker. This is what remains of the gun that won the West. A licensing agreement, a historical park, contaminated soil, and a neighborhood that never recovered. So what can we learn from this? Because the story of Colt isn't ancient history. It's a template that keeps repeating in different industries, in different cities, with the same devastating results. Lesson 1. War is not a business model. Colt's greatest successes came during conflicts. The Mexican-American War launched the company. The Civil War made it dominant. World War I and World War II provided temporary reprieves from decline. But building a business around military contracts means building a business that collapses every time peace breaks out. The cycles of boom and bust that defined Colt's history were predictable consequences of depending on government orders that could vanish overnight. Companies that survive long-term need diverse, stable revenue streams. Colt never found them. Lesson 2. Innovation must be continuous. Samuel Colt revolutionized firearms manufacturing in the 1850s. Then the company spent the next century and a half coasting on that reputation. When cartridge ammunition replaced percussion caps, Colt was slow to adapt. When semi-automatic pistols replaced revolvers, Colt lagged behind. When polymer frames and modern materials transformed handgun design, Colt stuck with steel and tradition. The company that had invented modern gun manufacturing became allergic to change. Markets don't reward legacy, they reward relevance. Stop innovating and you become a museum piece. Lesson 3. Labor is not a cost to be minimized. Colt's management spent decades treating workers as expenses rather than assets. They cut wages, fought unions, replaced skilled employees with undertrained substitutes. The 4-year strike of the 1980s was the logical endpoint of that philosophy. It destroyed the company's quality reputation and drove away the institutional knowledge that no manual can replace. The workers who built Colt revolvers understood those machines at a level that managers never did. When they left, that knowledge left with them. Treating labor as disposable creates disposable companies. Lesson 4. Brand is not a strategy. For decades, Colt's executives seemed to believe that the name alone would sustain the business. People bought Colts because Colts were famous. Cowboys carried them. Soldiers trusted them. The Peacemaker was an American icon. But brand equity erodes when products disappoint. Consumers who bought strike-era Colts and found them unreliable stopped buying Colts. And dealers who couldn't get consistent quality stopped stocking Colts. The name that Samuel Colt spent his life building became a warning rather than a recommendation. Reputation is earned with every product, every year. It cannot be inherited indefinitely. Lesson 5. Communities pay for corporate failures. When Colt collapsed, executives moved on to other jobs at other companies. Shareholders took their losses and invested elsewhere. But the workers and families and neighborhoods that had built their lives around the factory had nowhere to go. They couldn't diversify their exposure. They couldn't restructure their debts in bankruptcy court. They just absorbed the damage and tried to survive. The social contract that once bound employers to communities has frayed almost completely, but the consequences of breaking it remain. And look at the Blue Dome one more time. It was meant to be a monument to American industrial genius, a symbol of what ambition and innovation could achieve. It became a tombstone. Samuel Colt was a failed actor, a carnival huckster, a man who went bankrupt before he was 30 and remade himself into an industrial titan. He built weapons that changed history. He pioneered manufacturing techniques that shaped every industry that followed. He created a brand so powerful that people stopped saying revolver and just said Colt. And none of it lasted. The factories closed. The workers scattered. The brand got sold to foreigners. The community collapsed. What remains is a historical park, a contaminated riverbank, and lessons that American industry keeps refusing to learn. The Colt story isn't unique. It's Singer and Kodak and Bethlehem Steel and 100 other names that once seemed invincible. Giants fall, empires crumble. The only thing that survives is the pattern, and the pattern keeps repeating because the people who could learn from it never think it applies to them. That's the real legacy of the Armory that changed America, not the guns, not the dome, not the mythology of the Wild West. The legacy is this: success is fragile, empires are temporary, and the ruins are still being paid for by people who had no say in the decisions that created them. The Blue Dome still rises above Hartford, a monument to what was built, a warning about what was lost.